The very mention of pirates conjures vivid images. Skull and crossbones fluttering against a stormy sky, cutlasses gleaming in the tropical sun, and chests overflowing with glittering gold. While Hollywood has certainly romanticized these swashbuckling outlaws, the Golden Age of Piracy, particularly in the sun-drenched, treacherous waters of the Caribbean from the late 17th to the early 18th centuries, was a brutal, fascinating, and surprisingly complex period. This wasn't merely a time of maritime marauders. It was an era shaped by geopolitical tensions, economic desperation, and a peculiar brand of lawlessness that, for a fleeting moment, allowed ordinary men and even women to carve out extraordinary destinies. Imagine the Caribbean of the late 1600s, a chaotic chessboard where European powers, primarily Britain, France, and Spain, constantly vied for supremacy. Wealth flowed like water from the mines of South America and the plantations of the West Indies, transported on vast treasure fleets vulnerable to attack. This volatile environment was the perfect incubator for piracy. Many who turned to piracy weren't born villains. They were often former privateers whose commissions were revoked after wars ended, desperate sailors escaping harsh naval discipline or brutal merchant ship conditions, or even escaped enslaved people seeking freedom and revenge. The allure of untold riches, combined with a yearning for a life free from oppressive authority, proved an irresistible siren song. Yet, this wasn't just about wanton plunder. Pirates, often surprisingly organized, established their own codes of conduct, sharing spoils, maintaining discipline, and even offering a rudimentary form of democracy aboard their vessels. They operated from remote island havens like Nassau in the Bahamas, which, for a time, functioned as an unofficial pirate republic, a lawless sanctuary where rum flowed freely and stolen goods changed hands. These hideouts were strategic, offering easy access to busy shipping lanes while providing natural defenses against naval patrols. The ships themselves were marvels of their time, modified for speed and firepower. A typical pirate vessel, often a fast sloop or brigantine, would be heavily armed with cannons and bristling with small arms. The objective wasn't always to sink a target. Often, it was to intimidate them into surrender with a display of overwhelming force, minimizing damage to both ships and cargo. Psychological warfare was a key component of their tactics, and the sight of a pirate flag was often enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned merchant captain. But behind the larger-than-life myths were real people, some of whom became household names, figures whose exploits echoed across the Atlantic and whose legacies continue to captivate us today. These weren't just faceless villains. They were individuals with backstories, ambitions, and ultimately, fates as dramatic as any fictional tale. We're talking about the terrifying Blackbeard, whose very appearance was designed to inspire terror, the enigmatic Captain Kidd, whose transformation from respectable privateer to infamous pirate remains a subject of historical debate, and the daring duo of Calico Jack Rackham, accompanied by the audacious and Bonnie and Mary Red, two women who defied societal norms to fight alongside men in a world dominated by men. Their lives, filled with daring raids, clever strategies, and often violent ends, paint a vivid picture of a turbulent era when the rules of the sea were rewritten by those who dared to live outside the law. As we delve into their stories, we'll uncover not just the thrill of their audacious captures and the ingenuity of their tactics, but also the inevitable reckoning they faced. The Golden Age, though glorious for some, was ultimately fleeting, as naval powers eventually mounted concerted efforts to eradicate the scourge of piracy. The tales of their rise and fall offer a unique window into a pivotal moment in maritime history, where freedom and fortune clashed violently with order and retribution. Before the name Blackbeard spread like thunder across the Caribbean, he was simply Edward Teach, or perhaps Thatch, depending on which whisper you follow. No one quite knows where he was born, only that the sea seemed to call him early, and he answered with quiet fury. Some say he fought for the British crown during the War of Spanish Succession, learning the way of ships and swords before turning away from the flags of empire. Others believe he was always a pirate at heart, waiting for the world to unravel just enough to let him through. What is certain is that he emerged like a storm. Around 1716, he sailed under the infamous Benjamin Hornigold, learning the craft of plunder. But it didn't take long for Teach to command his own ship, and then a fleet. His most famous vessel was a captured French slaver, which he rechristened Queen Anne's Revenge, fitting her with 40 cannons and a reputation that grew heavier with each raid. But it wasn't the firepower alone that gave Blackbeard his myth. It was how he used it. He understood that fear was a weapon more potent than steel. Before battle, he would weave slow-burning fuses into his thick black beard, lighting them so smoke would curl around his face like mist from the underworld. Witnesses claimed his eyes glowed behind the haze, like coals beneath ash. He didn't need to kill to win. Most of the time, he didn't. Ships surrendered without a shot, frightened by the legends sailing toward them. His blockade of the port of Charleston, South Carolina, in 1718 was a masterpiece of calculated terror. Break time equals 0. 25s, / for nearly a week, no ships could leave or enter. Hostages were taken. The town trembled. And in the end, Blackbeard took only medicine and supplies, then vanished into the horizon. But legend breeds enemies. And the colonies, chafing under his shadow, began to strike back. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard to hunt him. Maynard's sloop tracked Blackbeard to a shallow inlet off Ocracoke Island. There, in the gray light of morning, the legend bled into history. They say Blackbeard fought like a man with no tomorrow. He withstood 5 gunshots, more than 20 sword wounds, and still kept swinging. It took a final slash to the neck to bring him down. His severed head was hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's ship as proof the ghost had been silenced. But silence is never complete. To this day, they say his body swam 3 times around the ship before sinking. That in the fog off Ocracoke, you can still hear footsteps on the deck where no one stands. That when the water stills just right, a flicker of smoke trails over the sea, vanishing like breath in cold air. Blackbeard is gone, but he never truly left. In every story of pirates told beneath moonlight, his name curls upward like smoke from a dying match. He is the beginning of the Golden Age, a shadow made of salt and fire. Not all pirates began their journey in darkness. Some were drawn into it slowly, as if by an undertow beneath seemingly calm waters. Such was the fate of William Kidd, a man who might have remained a respectable privateer had the world been just a little kinder or his choices just a little firmer. Break time equals 0. 25s, / but the sea does not often wait for hesitation. And Kidd, once loyal to the crown, found himself lost between duty and desperation. He was born in Dundee, Scotland, and made his way to the New World in the late 1600s. By the 1690s, he was an established captain, well respected in New York and London, even rubbing shoulders with nobility. It was there that his path twisted. Commissioned by English authorities to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean, he set sail aboard the Adventure Galley in 1696, not as a criminal, but as a man of justice. But justice is a thin sail in rough waters. The seas were harsh. His crew grew restless, many recruited from prisons and harbors already thick with outlaw hearts. When weeks turned to months without a prize, tension mounted like thunderclouds. Then came the Quebec Merchant, an Armenian ship sailing under French passes, but owned by Indian merchants. It was valuable, heavily laden, and its capture would later define Kidd's life. Some say it was lawful prize, others claimed it was piracy. Kidd took it, renamed it Adventure Prize, and set a course home, unknowing that back in England, the winds had turned against him. By the time he reached the Caribbean, he was already branded a pirate. Friends turned cautious. Support vanished. He buried some of his treasure on Gardiner's Island, hoping to use it as a bargaining chip. It didn't matter. In 1701, Kidd stood trial in London. It was a spectacle. The documents that could have proved his innocence, his French passes, were mysteriously lost before trial. He defended himself as best he could, but the verdict was already sealed. He was sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, the rope broke on the first attempt. The crowd gasped, taking it as a sign. But no mercy came. On the second attempt, the noose held. His body was tarred and hung in chains at Tilbury Point, a warning to all who might blur the line between sailor and thief. And yet, his name lingered. For centuries, treasure hunters scoured coasts and coves, convinced Kidd had left behind something more than just stories. Fragments of his tale turned up in novels, legends, and whispered maps that promised more than gold. Captain Kidd was no Blackbeard. He ruled no fleet. He lit no fuse in his beard. But in his doubt and downfall, he became a different kind of pirate legend, not born of cruelty, but of caution, not of smoke and fire, but of the shadows in between. And in that quiet space between hero and villain, Kidd still sails, forever questioning which flag he truly flew. There was a pirate who never wore armor, never ruled a fortress, and never burned a city to the ground. Yet his symbol endures more vividly than any conqueror's banner. A skull, two crossed cutlasses, and a black field of defiance. This was the mark of John Calico Jack Rackham. A man more known for flair than ferocity, he drifted into history not with the roar of cannons, but with the swish of striped cotton and the quiet rebellion of love and choice. Rackham earned his nickname from his flamboyant dress, preferring calico coats over the salt-stained garb of most seafarers. He did not begin as a legend. His rise was slow, opportunistic, and tangled in politics of the sea. Serving first as quartermaster under Charles Vane, another pirate infamous for cruelty, Rackham's big break came when he staged a mutiny and took command of the ship. His reign was short, but marked by boldness. He plundered small merchant vessels along the Bahamas, steering clear of large battles and choosing agility over brute force. His weapon was timing. His treasure was mobility. And aboard his ship sailed two of the most extraordinary figures in pirate history, and Bonnie and Mary Red. And Bonnie was no ordinary stowaway. She disguised herself as a man to live freely on the ship, but soon revealed her identity, and her ferocity in battle stunned even the most hardened sailors. Mary Read joined in similar fashion, her own life a tapestry of concealed identity, survival, and defiance. Together, the three formed a triangle of rebellion, not just against empire, but against the roles the world had assigned them. Their ship, the Revenge, became a drifting theater of freedom and resistance. They fought side by side. They drank, swore, and roamed the sea with conviction. But the dream could not last forever. In 1720, while anchored off Jamaica, Rackham and his crew were surprised by a British sloop. Many of his men were drunk. The fight was quick. Only and Mary resisted capture, firing their pistols and cursing their crewmates for their cowardice. The trial was swift. Rackham was sentenced to hang. In his final days, he was granted one last visit from Bonnie. Her words to him were cold and sharp. If you'd fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. He was executed on November 18, 1720, in Port Royal. His body was hung in chains on a small island later called Rackham's Cay, a grim echo of his flamboyant life. But symbols endure. His flag, the skull and crossed swords, was unlike any before it. It did not scream vengeance. It did not mimic the Jolly Roger of others. It became something more, a shorthand for rebellion, for the refusal to kneel, for living outside the code. And in this way, Calico Jack did what empires could not. He carved an icon into the wind. A mark that flew not over castles, but over the dreams of every soul who ever yearned to sail where no rule could reach them. When the Caribbean wind stirred the sails of outlaw ships, most expected to see bearded men at the helm, faces burned by sun and sea, eyes like storm glass. But beneath the same canvas sky and over the same swells, there were also secrets far stranger than treasure maps or cursed gold. Two of the fiercest pirates of that golden age sailed not just against the empire, but against the expectations of their own time. Their names were Bonnie and Mary Red, and for a time, They carved fear into the sea, dressed as men, fought like wolves, and lived like ghosts. And Bonnie was born in County Cork, Ireland, around the year 1700, to a respectable household wrapped in scandal. Her mother had once been a servant, her father, a lawyer with more ambition than loyalty. When his indiscretions were discovered, the family fled to the colonies, settling in Charleston. There, amid tobacco fields and merchant ships, and grew into a girl too wild for corsets and tea rooms. She was known to wield a knife in arguments and once, according to whispered tales, burned down a plantation in revenge. But what pulled her from the land was not rage, but the allure of sea-born freedom. When she met the charismatic pirate Calico Jack Rackham in Nassau, and saw not only a lover but a key, one that could open the barred gates of womanhood and let her walk among equals. Disguised in men's clothing, with her red hair tied back and a pistol at her waist, she joined Rackham's crew. There were no introductions, no welcome toasts. Only the swaying of the deck, the call of gulls, and the cold-eyed testing of her blade by those who doubted her. She proved herself not in words, but in boarding actions and blade work, quick, brutal, and without hesitation. It was in this unlikely theater that she crossed paths with another secret soldier of the sea, Mary Red. Mary had grown up on deception. Born illegitimate in England, her mother had disguised her as her dead brother to keep a family inheritance flowing. The charade became her skin. She lived as a boy, joined the army, fought in wars, and loved a soldier whom she later married. But war ends and love fades. Mary eventually found herself aboard a ship bound for the West Indies, where her journey was hijacked, literally. Captured by pirates, she made a choice: stay prisoner or join the life of the Cutlass. She chose the latter, and through grit and courage, she too earned a place as one of the crew. When Anne and Mary met, it wasn't with shock, but with recognition. Beneath the borrowed clothes and hardened stares were two women who had twisted fate in their favor. They became not just comrades, but confidants. Some say they were lovers, others say sisters of the storm. Whatever the truth, their bond was forged in battle and sealed in blood. In raids, the pair were often first to board and last to retreat. They were relentless, cutting through defenses like the wind through sailcloth. Their presence unnerved their enemies, not just for the skill they displayed, but for the audacity of their existence. Two women, feared more than many men, fighting for spoils in a world that denied them everything but scorn. Yet every sea has its calm, and every wind its silence. In 1720, their ship, Revenge, was cornered off the coast of Jamaica by a privateer under the command of Captain Jonathan Barnett. Most of the crew, including Calico Jack, were too drunk to resist, and Mary stood alone, pistols drawn, shouting at their crewmates to fight. When the smoke cleared, they were captured, tried, and sentenced to hang. But both revealed they were pregnant, a plea that delayed their execution. Calico Jack was hanged quickly, with Anne's last words to him recorded as, "If you had fought like a man, you need not be hanged like a dog." Mary died in prison, likely from fever or childbirth, and, however, vanished from the pages of official record. Some say she was freed by her father's influence, others that she escaped and lived under a new name. A quiet life, perhaps, or perhaps not. The sea has a way of keeping its secrets. To this day, their story whispers through taverns and titipools, not because they were women, but because they refused to be anything else but themselves. They didn't ask permission. They carved it. They stood beside killers and outlaws and proved that courage is not bound by gender, but by grit, spirit, and the unrelenting call of the horizon. Their swords are rusted now, if they survive at all. But the tale of Bonnie and Mary Red drifts on the ocean breeze, unseen, unclaimed, and entirely unforgettable. If you could step back through the sea-misted veil of time and stand on the golden shores of New Providence, you might hear music where order once reigned, laughter over the clink of mugs, the cry of gulls mixing with the sound of dice tumbling across ale-stained tables, and above it all, the flapping of black sails in the harbor, each one a flag of defiance. For a brief and blistering moment in the early 18th century, Nassau was not just a town. It was a kingdom of thieves, and every pirate was a prince. Nassau, nestled in the Bahamian chain, had not been designed to host legends. Originally a sleepy colonial outpost of the British Crown, it had fallen victim to neglect and hurricanes, its fortifications crumbling like stale bread. What remained was a shallow harbor perfect for small ships, with no standing army and no governor brave enough to last. In this gap, where empire failed, the outlaws came flooding in. By the early 1710s, a strange fraternity had taken root here, a brotherhood of sea wolves who'd slipped loose from the navies and merchant fleets of Europe. They brought with them captured cannons, rum by the barrel, and a new code of order born not from kings but from the chaos of survival. They called themselves the Flying Gang. Calico Jack Rackham, Charles Vane, Benjamin Hornigold, and the infamous Blackbeard, Edward Teach, each held sway over different corners of the harbor. Some were firebrands, others strategists, but all agreed on one thing: Nassau would be theirs. No taxes, no kings, no masters. A tattered tavern served as their court. The beach was their council floor. Disputes were settled with duels or dice, depending on the mood. They adopted a pirate code, equal shares for all, compensation for injuries, and a vote on major decisions. In some twisted irony, this lawless republic enforced more equity than most monarchies of the time. Ships came and went like drifting ghosts, their hulls filled with spices, gold, weapons, and sometimes prisoners taken in raids. They sailed under flags of red and black, boasting hourglasses, skeletons, and bleeding hearts, symbols of death, yes, but also warnings. We are free, and we will fight for it. The Republic of Pirates was not just a den of greed. It was also a shelter. Runaway slaves found refuge among the crews. Former sailors disillusioned by brutal discipline and empty paybooks discovered democracy, rough and salted, but real. Women like Bonnie and Mary Red could wear blades on their belts without explanation. In the eyes of Europe, it was anarchy, but for many who had been trampled by empire, it was paradise. Yet Nassau was never safe. Not truly. The British Crown, eager to reclaim its territory, plotted in silence. Spain and France, nursing their own wounds from pirate raids, watched like wolves beyond the trees. But inside the bay, the pirates danced. They sang shanties that shook the palm trees. They built ships on the shore and buried rumors in the sand. Blackbeard held feasts in the moonlight, lighting fuses in his beard to terrify onlookers. Charles Vane schemed on the high cliffs, planning his next strike against a merchant convoy. And beneath it all, in candlelit dens, maps were drawn. Maps of dreams, maps of dominion, maps of escape. The Republic lived without a clock. Days blurred into weeks, tides into stories. Every successful raid returned not just gold, but a kind of momentum, proof that they were building something, even if it was built on plunder. But the sea has a way of balancing its debts. In 1718, that balance came in the form of Woodes Rogers, a former privateer turned royal governor. He arrived not with swords, but with promises, a pardon for every pirate who would lay down arms, and death for those who would not. Some took the pardon. Hornigold, ever the pragmatist, helped hunt down former allies. But others like Vane resisted, branding Rogers a tyrant. Nassau, once alive with song and smoke, grew tense. Friendships frayed. Trust dissolved into the salt spray. Rogers rebuilt the fort. British troops manned the watchtowers. Cannons once pointed outward toward invaders now aimed inward at the homes of former pirates. The Republic had no walls to defend, no diplomats to speak its case. It vanished as it had risen, quickly, defiantly, and without apology. Yet even as the last black sails disappeared over the horizon, Nassau remained changed. The stones remembered. The beaches held their secrets. Some say the coins still surface after storms, doubloons stamped with forgotten empires, half sunken in the coral sand. The pirate republic lasted only a few years, but its spirit endures. It asked a question that still echoes across oceans. What if freedom was not granted, but taken? What if order could be chosen, not imposed? No parliament ever voted Nassau into being. No crown ever blessed its rule. It existed because the sea allowed it, and because enough people believed that something better might be built from wreckage. Today, the bay is quiet. Tourists walk the same shores where the flying gang once plotted. Children swim in waters once filled with cannon smoke. But if you listen closely, especially when the tide turns just right, you might hear it. A faint echo of laughter, the clink of a tankard, the rustle of sails gone long to rot. Nassau was never meant to last. But like all true myths, it lives, not in stone or law, but in the spaces between waves. Chapter 6. Beneath the Black Flag. Codes, Brotherhood, and the Hidden Order of Pirate Life. When the wind howled over the Caribbean and sails billowed like wings of defiance, there was one banner that turned the blood of merchant captains cold, the Black Flag. Not merely a symbol of terror, the skull and crossbones fluttering high above the mast stood for something far more intricate. It was not chaos, but a peculiar kind of order. Beneath the Black Flag, pirates lived by codes, unwritten by kings, but honored like gospel among outlaws. In the public imagination, pirates were savages, unruly, and bloodthirsty. Yet within their floating republics, strict rules governed every detail, from plunder division to conduct during battle. They were born not just from necessity, but from rebellion, a response to the brutal conditions endured under naval and merchant captains who wielded power like tyrants. On a pirate ship, the quartermaster shared power with the captain, and every crewman had a vote. It was a democracy forged at sea, among cannon smoke and sun-scorched decks. Before a voyage, each crew signed articles, documents outlining the rules of their micro-society. Some outlawed gambling, others forbade bringing women aboard. Shares of loot were determined in advance. The captain often received 2 shares, the quartermaster slightly less, and even the cook had a right to a portion. Injuries were compensated too. Losing a limb might mean extra coin. In this way, the articles acted as contracts, binding the crew not by force but by mutual agreement. In contrast to naval discipline, pirate justice was swift but not arbitrary. A man who disobeyed might be flogged or marooned, but not without a hearing. Many crews had rotating councils to decide disputes. Some even had early forms of workers' compensation and medical leave, decided not by authority but by group consensus. The sea, indifferent and cruel, required a level of cooperation that only such a code could bring. The Black Flag itself was more than just an emblem. It was a psychological weapon. When raised, it promised no mercy if resistance was given, but it also hinted at clemency if surrender came quickly. In many ways, pirates preferred not to fight. A bloodless victory meant more profit, fewer wounds. Thus, their terror was carefully curated, an art of fear rather than indiscriminate violence. And in this, the flag spoke louder than cannon fire. Symbols mattered deeply. Flags varied. Calico Jack flew a skull with crossed cutlasses. Blackbeard preferred a horned skeleton raising a toast beside a bleeding heart. These were not chosen at whim, but crafted to strike precisely the right blend of dread and identity. For a pirate, branding was survival. The moment their flag appeared on the horizon, it could decide whether a ship resisted or yielded without a shot. But brotherhood was the deepest current beneath the surface. These were men, and in rarer cases, women, cast out or self-exiled from society, bound together not just by gold, but by shared experience. Many had fled impressment, slavery, or injustice. On a pirate ship, color and rank blurred. Black sailors might serve as gunners or helmsmen. Freedmen could rise to power. The code leveled the deck in more ways than one. Still, life was no utopia. Disease, starvation, betrayal, and storms haunted every journey. The codes were often broken as quickly as they were signed. Greed had its way. Mutinies were not uncommon, and loyalty could dissolve like salt in rain. Yet for all its contradictions, piracy offered something the land often denied: freedom. Brutal and fleeting, yes, but freedom nonetheless. And so, the Black Flag came to signify not only death and plunder, but a fleeting experiment in autonomy. Floating nations with no borders, governed by votes, choices, and brutal consequence. In the silence before an attack, when the flag was slowly hoisted and the crew stood ready, there was more at stake than treasure. There was a glimpse, however brief, of a world reordered, built not by kings but by those who had rejected them. Chapter 7. Raiding the Empire, the great pirate assaults on Spanish treasure fleets. By moonlight and cannon fire, across waters gilded with greed, the most daring pirate raids unfolded not in chaos, but in silence first, like a breath held too long before the plunge. These were not random acts of violence. They were rehearsed, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. And at the heart of them all was a single glittering goal: the Spanish treasure fleets. Spain's wealth, drawn from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, flowed through the Caribbean like a silver tide. Every few months, galleons laden with bullion, emeralds, cacao, and indigo would gather in Havana, then set sail for Seville. They were the lifeblood of an empire, and the most tempting prize a pirate could dream of. To strike a treasure fleet was madness. The ships were armored and escorted, their gunners trained, their routes well guarded. But madness, for men with nothing to lose and everything to gain, was merely another word for ambition. And in the early 18th century, a handful of crews turned that ambition into history. They stalked the convoy routes like patient wolves, waiting, studying, memorizing the patterns of imperial cargo. Edward Blackbeard Teach was said to have blockaded Charleston not for gold, but for medicine. Henry Jennings made his name raiding Spanish salvage teams after a hurricane scattered their treasure along the Florida coast. For him, the gold was literally washing ashore. But the boldest raid of all came in 1720, when Bartholomew Blackbeard Roberts attacked a fleet of over 40 Portuguese and Spanish ships anchored off Cape Lopez. Alone, aboard his vessel Royal Fortune, he struck in the morning mist, sailing straight into the heart of the flotilla. By nightfall, the bay belonged to him. He captured the flagship Sagrada Familia, its hull heavy with over 40,000 gold coins. The key to such victories lay not just in bravery, but in preparation. Pirate captains trained their men relentlessly. They drilled boarding parties, timed their approaches with wind and tide, and struck with the ferocity of soldiers, but none of the constraints. Without rules of engagement or chains of command, they moved faster, more intuitively. They were unpredictable, and that made them terrifying. And then there was intelligence. Pirates cultivated spies in every colonial port. Tavern keepers, dock workers, even clergy traded whispers for coin. A rumor about a delayed fleet in Veracruz could reach a pirate haven in Tortuga within days. The Caribbean was a web of invisible threads, and the pirates had learned how to pluck them. When the moment came, it came quickly. A sudden appearance on the horizon. Black sails against the sunrise. Cannons fired low to shatter hulls. Grappling hooks thrown with precision. Screams, smoke, steel against splintering wood. And just like that, a vessel worth a kingdom fell into outlaw hands. But the treasure was more than gold. It was a message. Every captured galleon chipped away at the illusion of empire. Every vanished fleet reminded Europe's kings that their reach had limits. On the open sea, wealth did not always belong to those with the most guns, but to those willing to risk everything to take it. For a few fleeting decades, the pirates of the Caribbean turned royal ambition against itself. They raided the veins of empire, severed supply lines, and left colonial governors fumbling for answers. These raids did not just enrich, they reshaped. The map may not have changed, but the fear it carried deepened. And always, behind the spectacle, came the stillness of the sea, indifferent, ancient, and vast. The same sea that bore the ships of kings now bore the ships of men who defied them. And beneath the shadow of the Jolly Roger, silver and blood spilled alike, quiet testaments to a world not quite under control. Break time equals 0. 25s / Chapter 8 Pirate Havens and Floating Republics, the islands that sheltered an outlaw world. Long before the maps gave them names, the islands of the Caribbean waited, lush, volcanic, and ringed in coral. Some were little more than specks of sand and palms. Others held hidden coves and freshwater springs. But in the Golden Age of Piracy, these islands were more than mere dots on a chart. They were breathing spaces for outlaws, where a different kind of order ruled, a floating republic beneath the black flag. The world of empires was made of courts and crowns, but the world of pirates was stitched together by whispers, oaths, and spoils. When ships returned from raids, heavy with Spanish silver or colonial supplies, they needed shelter, not just from storms, but from navies. And so, from the Bahamas to Tortuga, certain islands became sanctuaries not governed by law, but by pact. The most infamous of all was New Providence in the Bahamas. By the early 1700s, it had transformed into a pirate republic in all but name. The streets of Nassau echoed with a dozen languages, its harbor bristling with sloops and schooners flying no national flag. Drunken toasts were raised not to kings, but to Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Benjamin Hornigold. Here, governance was ad hoc, but not absent. Captains were chosen by vote. Spoils were divided by agreed shares. Injuries were compensated with extra gold. Even codes of conduct were drawn. Rules forbidding theft among crew, rules for curfews aboard ships, rules for how punishment should be handled. It was not chaos. It was community, forged in survival and shared defiance. Further south, the rocky heights of Tortuga once sheltered the flibustiers, French buccaneers turned raiders. The island offered little in resources, but much in position. From its rugged coastlines, pirates could strike at Spanish merchant routes, then vanish into the blue. In the crude taverns and timbered docks, the air was thick with smoke, salt, and secrets. Here, the edge between exile and freedom blurred. Other islands, St. Thomas, Madagascar's Île Sainte Marie, even parts of Jamaica when overlooked, served similar roles. They became staging grounds, repair docks, marketplaces for contraband. Guns were traded for spices. Charts were scribbled on hide. Crews swapped rumors of convoys and tides. In these forgotten corners of empire, pirate society bloomed. But it was not merely the physical shelter that these havens offered. It was a vision, however fleeting, of a different kind of world. One where background mattered less than bravery. Where a runaway slave could become a quartermaster. Where a woman like Bonnie could dress as a man and fight as fiercely as any sailor. Where votes, not birth, decided a captain's fate. To the imperial powers, these pirate enclaves were festering wounds, sources of shame, danger, and rebellion. But to the sailors who had faced lashes, starvation wages, and arbitrary discipline aboard merchant vessels, they were freedom itself. In the makeshift huts of Nassau or the hidden caves of Hispaniola, they built a society not of nobles, but equals. The floating republics were not utopias. They had their own vices, drink, cruelty, rivalries, and betrayals. But they stood apart from the rigid hierarchies of Europe. In these places, law came not from a crown, but from consensus. Decisions were made on deck, not in palaces. Every raid was a vote. Every mutiny a referendum. And so, a strange experiment in seaborne democracy drifted across the tropics. Temporary, unstable, but undeniable. For a time, the Caribbean belonged not to kings, but to those willing to risk the gallows for a glimpse of liberty. The pirate flag did not merely signify danger. It signified a challenge to the world as it was. As the sun dipped behind palm-lined shores, the sails returned from the horizon, weather-beaten, smoke-stained, tattered by salt and wind. And in the coves of their choosing, these outlaw crews came ashore to rest, to repair, to celebrate, and to remember that for all its dangers, the sea had given them something the land had not, the right to choose. It would not last. Already, ships were being dispatched. Governors were being empowered. Treaties were being drawn. The age of the pirate haven was nearing its twilight. But for those years when cannon smoke mingled with rum and salt, a different kind of freedom flew on the wind. And it had no king. Chapter 9. The Treasure Fleets, Gold, Galleons, and the Pirates Who Hunted Them. When rain fell over the Isthmus of Panama, it struck gold, not metaphorically, but truly. For behind the humid veil of mangroves and jungle trails lay a path of empire, paved with silver bars, emeralds wrapped in cloth, and chests so heavy they broke the backs of mules. From the mountain mines of Potosi to the vaults of Seville, Spain's new world flowed with treasure. And over this current, pirates gathered like shadows in the tide. The Spanish treasure fleets, Flotas de Indias, were among the most formidable logistical operations in the world. Twice a year, galleons would sail from Veracruz and Cartagena, converging in Havana before crossing the Atlantic as one vast, guarded convoy. Their holds brimmed not only with gold and silver, but cacao, indigo, spices, pearls, and cochineal. The ships were the arteries of empire, pulsing with wealth. But to the pirates, they were something else entirely, floating fortresses of hope. Each galleon was a prize worth risking death for. The fleets moved like planets, predictable in season, but massive and shielded. Still, where there were charts, there were leaks. Where there were winds, there were chances. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, knew this well. His eyes were not fixed on random merchants, but on the great sea lanes where gold flowed like blood. He was not the only one. Henry Morgan, long before becoming a governor, led daring raids not just at sea, but deep inland, assaulting Spanish towns that fed the treasure routes. His sacking of Panama City in 1671, though technically outside the Golden Age, laid the blueprint. Don't wait for the treasure to come to you. Go and seize its source. But it was not always brute force. Some pirate captains became students of the sea. They charted the currents, counted the moons, timed the tides. When the Spanish fleet was delayed or scattered by hurricanes, lone galleons became easy prey. In 1708, off the coast of Colombia, the treasure galleon San Jose exploded during a British engagement. Its remains, and untold billions in modern value, now sleep beneath the waves. These were not just stories of gunpowder and greed. There was a strange reverence among pirates for the treasures they chased. Gold was not only a prize, it was a promise. Many of them had begun as poor seamen or indentured crew, starved and flogged on naval ships. The sight of doubloons and emeralds was not only thrilling, it was proof that fortune could be wrested from fate. And so, in quiet coves and smoky taverns, rumors of treasure galleons were passed like sacred texts. This year's fleet was late. A hurricane had split them near Hispaniola. A lone vessel limped toward Florida. These fragments, half truth and half dream, were enough to send crews sprinting for their ships, hoisting black sails, and vanishing into the horizon. Some succeeded, some did not. For every captain who struck gold, another met his end in storms or ambushes. Spanish escorts were no easy foes. Galleons bristled with cannons, and their soldiers fought with desperation. But when the odds aligned, when an escort was delayed or a prize ship became separated, the rewards could sustain a crew for years. Yet the gold itself, once taken, became a burden. Where to hide it? How to divide it? How to spend it without drawing the eyes of governors and hangmen? Treasure was heat, and in an age of informants and royal pardons, heat could kill. Some pirates buried their hoards. Some squandered them in nights of wine and flame. Some, like Captain Kidd, were accused of treasures they may never have found, hanged more for rumor than proof. Even the sea could not always keep its secrets. Storms shattered many a treasure ship before pirates could reach them. Off the Florida Keys, Spanish galleons sank by the dozen, flung onto coral shoals in 1715. For centuries, pieces of eight would wash ashore, staining the sand with echoes of empire. Even today, treasure hunters still walk those beaches, hoping for a glint in the foam. But the pirate did not need to hold the gold to be changed by its pursuit. The chase itself was transformative. It turned ordinary sailors into strategists, into brothers in arms, into legends whispered on the wind. It bent the purpose of ships from trade to rebellion. It gave the nameless a story. In the end, the great treasure fleets continued their voyages, more guarded, more secretive, increasingly tracked by navies and less by luck. But they had already done their part. They had fed the dream. They had drawn hundreds into a life where every sail on the horizon was a possibility. And in that dream, pirates carved their names not in stone, but in salt and in silence. Long after the galleons were gone, their routes remained etched in the sea. And when a ship creaked beneath the stars, with no flag and every cannon ready, it was not merely chasing treasure. It was chasing the illusion of a world where fortune could still be taken by those bold enough to claim it. Chapter 10: Punishment and Pardon. When empires finally struck back. There comes a point in every storm when the wind shifts, when the silence between gusts deepens, and the distant thunder becomes the voice of something greater than chance. For the pirates of the Caribbean, This moment arrived not with a sudden crash, but with the slow turning of imperial attention. The empires they had once bled so easily began to stir, and the shadows in which pirates thrived began to narrow. In the beginning, piracy was tolerated, sometimes even encouraged. Colonial governors turned blind eyes, merchants paid silent bribes, and privateers held government commissions like thin veils over their plunder. The chaos of empire made room for such contradictions. Spain, England, France, and the Dutch Republic were too busy expanding to plug every leak. And while pirates robbed their enemies, their sins were often forgiven. But empires grow not only in ambition, but in order. By the early 18th century, colonial ports had grown into vital arteries of commerce. Sugar plantations fed Europe's hunger, silver funded armies, and navies had begun to professionalize. What once had been remote and chaotic became strategic. And in this new age of regulation, the pirate was no longer a useful rogue. He was a threat to empire. Laws began to harden. Where once there had been ambiguity, now came proclamations. England, eager to reassert control over the seas, issued the 1717 Proclamation for the Suppression of Piracy. It offered a royal pardon to all pirates who surrendered within a year, except those who had already committed murder. For many, it was a lifeline. For others, it was bait. Some pirates took the offer. Benjamin Hornigold, once a feared captain, accepted the pardon and later turned hunter himself, tracking his former allies under the banner of law. Others like Stede Bonnet hesitated, unsure whether to trust the promises of kings. Bonnet, once a gentleman turned pirate, tried to retire in peace but was eventually captured, tried, and hanged in Charleston. His pardon had come too late, or his crimes too early. Then came the noose. British courts in Jamaica and the American colonies began staging mass trials. Gallows rose at harbor mouths, and the names of pirates became warnings rather than legends. At Port Royal, once a haven of excess and vice, the bodies of hanged men swung above the tide. In London, the execution of Captain Kidd decades earlier had already signaled the empire's changing mood, his bones left to rot in a cage by the Thames. But punishment alone was not enough. The empires sought not only to kill pirates, but to erase their world. Naval patrols increased. Islands like New Providence were reclaimed and fortified. Governors were instructed to crush pirate enclaves, to refuse bribes, and to offer no shelter. By 1718, Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself, had been appointed governor of the Bahamas with one mission: extinguish piracy. He arrived in Nassau, once a pirate republic, with soldiers and warships. Some pirates fled, some resisted. Charles Vane, known for his ferocity, refused the pardon and escaped to continue his raiding, only to be captured years later and hanged in Jamaica. Blackbeard, too, met his end not long after, cornered and slain off the coast of North Carolina. His body was thrown into the sea. His head was hung from a ship's bow. And yet, not all battles were won on the deck of a frigate. Some pirates faded into the world they had once plundered. They became fishermen, tavern keepers, even settlers. The pardon was not just a rope or salvation. It was a quiet ending, a chance to lay down the cutlass before the tide turned forever. Some took it with gratitude, others with regret. For the age itself was closing. By the 1730s, the great names had vanished. The oceans were mapped, the trade routes militarized, and the governors empowered. Naval power now reached across the Atlantic with unprecedented force. The balance of fear had shifted. Where once the sight of a black sail sent merchants scurrying, now it was pirates who watched the horizon, unsure whether salvation or death rode on the next wave. But history is rarely clean. While the Golden Age had ended, piracy did not. It transformed. It went deeper into the shadows, slipped into new forms: smuggling, slave raiding, maritime insurrection. Yet the romantic vision of the pirate, the one forged in fire and gold during those few dazzling decades, would never return. What the empires could never quite destroy, though, was the myth. Even as they hanged men and burned ships, stories slipped through the cracks. Songs were sung in ports, tales told in candlelit inns. He fought like a devil. He buried his treasure where no man could find it. He laughed at the gallows. These stories softened the edge of punishment and gave pirates a second life, not in reality, but in memory. And in some strange way, the empires needed those myths. They justified their own authority by contrast, law versus lawlessness, crown versus chaos. The pirate was the necessary villain, even after he was gone. He haunted their waters not as a man, but as a symbol, a shadow they had once feared, and, perhaps, secretly admired. So it was that punishment and pardon, sword and paper, gallows and forgiveness, all became tools in the Empire's campaign to reclaim their oceans. But even as the tide swept the pirates away, the echo of their laughter remained, like wind through the rigging, like a story never fully silenced. Because some truths can be buried, others only lie waiting to be found. Chapter 11: Myths That Refuse to Die, the Ghosts of Pirate Legends. Some legends cling not to parchment or coin, but to the very wind. Echoes in the canvas of old sails, whispers in the creak of dock ropes, silhouettes glimpsed through sea mist. Long after the last gallows fell silent, the pirates lived on, not in flesh, but in fable. And in many ways, the stories they left behind proved harder to kill than the men themselves. In taverns from Port Royal to Bristol, children pressed their ears to oak tables and listened wide-eyed to tales of buried treasure and ghost ships. Blackbeard, whose head once swung from a bowsprit, returned again and again in story, his beard still smoking, his pistol still primed. It was said he struck bargains with the devil himself, and that his gold was cursed, hidden in a cave no man dared enter twice. Calico Jack, who had died at Gallows Point, rose once more in whispers among sailors, remembered not for his failed raids, but for the women who fought at his side, and Bonnie and Mary Red. Their names were etched deeper than any royal decree, two shadows in breeches who fought fiercer than men, their blades flashing on moonlit decks, their fates forever blurred between fact and legend. But the sea does not distinguish easily between what is remembered and what is real. Maps were drawn with strange marks. Here be treasure, Isle of the Dead, Captain Avery's hoard. That last name, Henry Avery, lingered in the minds of both beggars and kings. Avery, who vanished after the greatest pirate heist of all, who left no corpse behind, only questions. It was said he built a kingdom in Madagascar, or lived as a prince among Moorish sultans. No one could prove it. That was the point. And there were the ships, ghost vessels without flags, drifting silently at twilight. Fishermen spoke of lights beneath the waves. Others told of a black schooner that appeared only before storms, crewed by skeletons still chained to their guns. These stories weren't just diversions. They were anchors, roots of a past too wild to forget, too poetic to discard. Even in courts and churches, the myth bled through. Sermons warned of pirate ghosts come to drag the unrepentant to watery graves. Some clergymen claimed the devil's mark could be seen in the strange compass roses drawn by old sailors. In times of drought, villagers dug near coastal rocks, convinced that cursed doubloons might be buried beneath. When children disappeared or ships wrecked without cause, whispers turned quickly to pirates, unquiet dead, seeking crew. The literature of the age began to pick up their scent. Penny broadsheets detailed exaggerated exploits of Captain Morgan, who in life had become a governor, but in death a larger-than-life trickster king. Ballads praised the free man of the sea, casting pirates not as criminals, but as rebels, warriors against tyranny, symbols of freedom on the open water. They were no longer simply hunted men. They were characters, heroes, phantoms. It was in the 18th and 19th centuries, long after the Golden Age had ended, that the image of the pirate truly crystallized, not by history, but by art. Painters showed rugged men with parrots on shoulders, cutlasses and belts, gold rings in ears. Writers like Daniel Defoe, writing under aliases, fed a hungry public tales of high-seas mischief, of secret islands, and mutiny. The pirates of ink were often more clever, more noble, and more charming than the real ones had ever been. One name above all became immortal: Treasure Island. Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883 novel wrapped every myth into one. The one-legged pirate with a talking parrot, the cryptic map, the young boy who finds courage at sea. It drew from fragments of true history, Blackbeard's cruelty, Avery's vanishing, Bonnet's awkward gentility, but shaped them into something new, the pirate as adventure. And the world believed it. Suddenly, the same empires that had hunted pirates for decades began to sell their stories in books and plays. Children's toys took the shape of galleons. Theater stages creaked with the sound of boarding parties. The gallows had failed in one important way. It had not killed the pirate in the imagination. In fact, it may have made him stronger. For the pirate became a mirror. To some, he reflected freedom, cutting loose from law, land, and crown. To others, he symbolized danger and chaos. But always, he stood just beyond the reach of certainty. A figure who could be anything, a villain, a hero, a ghost, depending on who told the tale. Even today, the Caribbean still holds those echoes. Tourists walk the ruins of old forts, not as mourners of imperial history, but as seekers of something romantic and elusive. Divers comb reefs in search of shipwrecks and chests that may never have existed. Locals still whisper of hidden coves and strange currents. And every so often, a rusted coin or rotted hull is found, and the stories breathe again. Because the truth is this: no empire can completely erase what it once feared. The pirates had lived in the margins, the fractures of imperial power, and even when the cracks were sealed, their shadows remained. In song, in tale, in dream. The ghost of the pirate walks still, not on the sea, but through the minds of those who gaze out upon it and wonder. Not in violence, but in myth. And in that myth lies something enduring, a challenge to order, a thirst for unknown shores, a reminder that beyond the map's edge, the world might still hold secrets. And that perhaps, just perhaps, a golden coin lies waiting beneath the sand, placed there by a hand long turned to dust, but never forgotten. Somewhere beneath a mangrove swamp, under a tangle of salt-stained roots, a rusted lockbox may still sit buried, sealed with iron clasps, wrapped in layers of oilskin and wax. Or perhaps it lies scattered beneath the waves, shattered open by cannon fire and centuries of coral growth. Or maybe, as many believe, it never existed at all. Yet few questions have endured with such stubbornness as this. What happened to the pirate treasure? Not the metaphorical kind, not the dream of adventure, but the tangible clink of gold, coins, jewels, ingots, and relics, the stuff that drove men to kill, to flee, to die grinning at the gallows. At the height of the Golden Age, treasure was real and heavy. It came in the form of silver bars from Peru, emerald-studded crucifixes from Spanish galleons, silk bundles from the East, spices by the barrel, and coinage minted in distant monarchies. Each piece bore not just value, but a story. A chain of hands through which it passed, from mine to merchant, priest to pirate. And the pirates took it, not in legend, but in volume. Black Sam Bellamy alone captured over 50 ships in a single year. Henry Every's raid on the Ganges Sawai yielded a fortune so immense that even years later, the British East India Company struggled to contain the scandal. The loot was not imagined. It was counted, argued over, buried, divided, fought for. But what followed remains strangely opaque. Unlike modern bank accounts or ledgers, pirate wealth had no paperwork. It was stashed in hammocks, buried in dunes, sewn into linings. And when the pirate died, as they so often did, by musket, typhoon, or betrayal, the gold often died with them. Some treasure made its way into cities, quietly laundered into the colonial economy. In Port Royal or Nassau, a rogue might pay for a tavern, a ship repair, a bribe. With coins stamped from Mexico or Arabia, smugglers acted as couriers, turning stolen cargo into spendable currency. Much of it disappeared into circulation, untraceable except by its wear and weight. Other hoards were hidden. That much we know. Pirates trusted no one, not even their own crew. It was common to bury a portion of one's share. Against lean times, they said. But lean times often came quickly, and a bullet or storm could silence a man before he returned to claim what he hid. And so the legends began. Of a chest hidden beneath an X-shaped tree on Oak Island. Of treasure concealed within the caves of Hispaniola or under the foundations of ruined forts. In the Carolinas, local fishermen swore that Stede Bonnet, before his capture, left behind a load of silver in a dry creek bed. In Jamaica, rumors told of a Spanish ship run aground by pirates who never returned to reclaim their haul. Searchers came. They dug, mapped, and measured. In the 19th century, entire expeditions were mounted to uncover pirate gold. The most famous, Oak Island in Nova Scotia, spawned centuries of fevered belief. Shafts were sunk, booby traps discovered, strange artifacts unearthed. And yet, no proof, no grand find, just the persistent whisper. It's still there. Historians remain divided. Some argue that most pirate wealth was frittered away. Pirates were rarely prudent. They spent lavishly, drank deeply, and gambled recklessly. A pirate who captured 1,000 pounds in coin might spend it all within weeks, on women, weapons, and rum. The rest was taken by those who arrested him, the spoils quietly absorbed by governors and magistrates who once hunted him. Yet others believe the treasure exists still, forgotten in remote places, protected by the indifference of time. There are cases, after all, that hint at truth. In 1984, off the coast of Florida, a wreck believed to be the Witta Galley, Sam Bellamy's flagship, was discovered. Among its remains, pistols, cannons, and a trove of gold coins still bearing the royal seals of Europe. More than just wealth, these relics proved something deeper, that the treasure once spoken of in whispers had physical form. That beneath the fantasy, there had been reality, hard, metallic, and buried in salt. And still, the search continues. Divers in the Bahamas follow sonar pulses across reefs. Metal detectors click across Caribbean beaches. Locals pass down maps stained with seawater and ink. And always, the same hope, to touch what the past concealed. But what is it that truly haunts us? Is it the treasure itself, or what it represents? For some, the lure is freedom, a belief that within one chest lies escape from the constraints of modern life. For others, it is justice. The thought that stolen wealth might still be reclaimed, setting history right. And for many, it is simply the romance of mystery, the dream that not all is known, that somewhere, beneath the earth or sea, the past waits, untouched. The treasure remains a mirror, reflecting our need for discovery, our hunger for story. And in that sense, perhaps the most valuable thing pirates ever left behind was not the gold itself, but the legend of its hiding. A silence wrapped in salt, inviting us to imagine, to seek, to dig, and maybe, one day, to find. They came like the slow tightening of a noose. First, a new governor with quiet orders. Then warships appearing on the horizon, anchored just far enough to make their presence felt. Then laws, decrees, and letters bearing royal seals, cold parchment against the heat of tropical rebellion. The pirate republics had flourished in a lull. A brief, strange interval when empires turned inward and the edges of the world belonged to no one. In places like Nassau, Tortuga, and New Providence, pirates had built something that was not quite a kingdom, but not mere chaos either. A fraternity, a floating alliance, a loose web of ships, captains, and codes. Here, men voted for their leaders, shared their loot, and chose when and how to fight. It was not lawless, only differently governed. The pirate republics thrived because they offered something the empires could not: equality among the lawless and reward for the daring. But such freedom could never last long under the gaze of kings. By the early 18th century, Europe's great powers had turned their eyes once again to the seas. Spain wanted its treasure routes secured. England wanted its colonies clean of scandal. France and Holland were realigning their priorities. And piracy, once a tolerated nuisance, became a political embarrassment. Something had to be done. The end came not as a thunderclap, but as a wave, slow, steady, and deliberate. In 1717, King George I of Britain issued the proclamation for suppressing of pirates, offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered within a year. It was a clever weapon, mercy as bait. Men who once defied empires were now offered peace, if they laid down their arms. Some accepted. The infamous Benjamin Hornigold, once mentor to Blackbeard, took the pardon and began hunting his former comrades. Others hesitated, unsure whether the offer was real or a trap. The Golden Age was beginning to crack from within. The man who would drive the nail deeper was Woodes Rogers. Once a privateer himself, Rogers was appointed royal governor of the Bahamas and sent to reclaim Nassau from the pirate lords. He arrived in 1718, bringing with him warships, troops, and a cold determination. Nassau, once a haven of freebooters, was transformed almost overnight. Rogers offered pardons to the cautious and gallows to the defiant. He rebuilt the town's fortifications, established courts, and reopened trade under British rule. The Wild Republic fell without a grand battle, undone not by cannon, but by strategy. Other strongholds followed. In the Caribbean, the French and Spanish increased their patrols. In the Indian Ocean, the British East India Company tightened control over its waters. Pirate ships found fewer safe harbors, fewer friendly ports. Their networks unraveled. Their legends began to outshine their power. Some captains resisted to the end. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, refused the pardon. He returned briefly to North Carolina, flirted with legality, then resumed his piracy. In November 1718, he was cornered at Ocracoke Inlet by Royal Navy Lieutenant Robert Maynard. The fight was brutal and close. Blackbeard was shot 5 times and slashed more than 20 before falling. His head was severed and hung from the bowsprit as proof. With each such death, the Republic faded. Charles Vane, the fierce dissenter, was captured and hanged in 1721. Calico Jack Rackham, known more for flair than force, was taken with his lovers and Bonnie and Mary Read, 2 of the few women to carve names into pirate history. He was executed in Jamaica. They vanished into prison, legend, and mystery. The final days were filled with desperation. Ships sailed farther, preyed on smaller targets, took refuge in Africa, Madagascar, or the coast of Brazil. But the world was closing in. Empires, once distracted by wars and rivalries, were aligning in their hatred of piracy. There was no room left for the unrolled. And yet, something curious happened. Even as their flags were struck down, the stories of pirates grew brighter. Plays were written, ballads sung, pamphlets printed. The people who had once feared pirates now began to admire them. Their downfall became part of the myth, proof that they had dared, if only for a time, to live by different rules. Why did they fall? Historians argue over timing, policy, and military decisions. But at its heart, the fall of the pirate republics was a return to control. The sea, it turned out, was too valuable to remain free. Its lanes too rich, its borders too porous. The empires wanted order, and order always swallows chaos, in time. But what remains? In Nassau, traces of the Republic still linger, in old walls, in names etched into dockside stones, in buried bottles found by modern feet. In old court records, you can read the transcripts of pirate trials, words once spoken by trembling men in shackles. And in books, films, and dreams, the pirate republics live on. They remind us of something we still quietly crave, not just the gold or the adventure, but the notion that people could choose their fate outside the reach of crowns. That, for a fleeting moment, there was a place where the sea was not ruled by empire, but by courage. A place where men and women, flawed, fearless, and free, built a new world and dared to fly the black flag above it. Chapter 14, The Last Pirate, How the Golden Age Truly Ended. By the time the sun began to set on the 1720s, the oceans had changed. The harbors were no longer safe, the governors no longer silent, and the sails on the horizon no longer friendly. One by one, the old pirates vanished, some hanged, some pardoned, and some simply lost to time. But the age was not yet over. Not completely. In the twilight of this golden era, one figure stood stubbornly in the fading light, a man who would not bow, who would not vanish. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, though he is better remembered by the name that echoed through the decks of merchant ships and the nightmares of admirals, Black Bart. He was not born a pirate. Few ever were. Roberts had begun his life in Wales and worked as a merchant sailor. He was competent, quiet, and religious, traits not commonly associated with pirates. But in 1719, while sailing aboard the slave ship Princess, he was captured by pirates off the West African coast. At first, Roberts had no intention of joining them. But fate, as it often did in those waters, had other plans. The pirate captain who had taken him aboard was soon killed in a skirmish. The crew, needing a new leader, turned to Roberts. He was bold, educated, and showed a sharp mind for navigation and plunder. Reluctantly, then resolutely, he accepted, and once he did, something inside him shifted. The quiet sailor vanished. What emerged was a man of order and ambition, perhaps the most successful pirate of them all. Unlike the drunken chaos often associated with pirate life, Roberts brought discipline. He created rules for his crew, forbade gambling, and insisted on cleanliness. He wore fine crimson clothes and a feathered hat, carried 2 pistols slung across his chest, and sipped tea while planning attacks. He was, in many ways, the mirror opposite of Blackbeard, less theatrical, more effective. And he was relentless. In just 3 years, Roberts captured over 400 ships, a staggering number, unmatched by any other pirate in history. He prowled the coasts of West Africa, the Caribbean, and even North America. He attacked slave ships, warships, and merchant vessels alike. His flags bore terrifying symbols. A skeleton with an hourglass, or Roberts standing on skulls. Yet even as his legend grew, the world around him was closing in. The Royal Navy, driven by orders from London, was hunting pirates with renewed fury. New governors were cracking down on corruption. Treaties between empires meant fewer safe havens. Roberts knew the tide was turning, but he did not slow. In February 1722, his ship, Royal Fortune, anchored off the coast of Gabon. The crew had grown tired, and Roberts, now 39 years old, seemed restless but unshaken. That morning, as he drank his coffee and dressed in scarlet silk, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was the British warship HMS Swallow, commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle. What followed was sudden and final. As the Swallow approached, Roberts ordered his crew to prepare for battle. He took his usual position at the rail, calm and proud. A single broadside erupted from the British guns. One cannonball tore through the air and struck him in the throat. He died instantly. His body, as per his own orders, was quickly wrapped in sailcloth, weighted, and dropped into the sea. He had always feared that if he fell, his corpse would be taken and displayed. He would have no such dishonor. The sea claimed him, and he vanished below the waves. With Roberts gone, his crew surrendered. Those captured were taken to Cape Coast Castle and put on trial. 52 men were hanged, the largest mass execution of pirates in the Atlantic world. Others were imprisoned or sent to forced labor. Only a handful escaped. And with that, the Golden Age ended. There were still pirates. There would always be pirates, but never again like this. Never again men who ruled harbors, built republics, and struck fear into entire fleets. The era of the great pirate captains, the floating brotherhoods, the codes and crimson coats had passed. Empires now controlled the seas. The Royal Navy patrolled where pirate ships once danced. Trade routes were secured. Colonies were fortified. And laws, harsh, uncompromising laws, were written in the name of kings and enforced with iron. But even as the world moved on, the memory of Black Bart endured. Sailors whispered his name at night. Writers recorded his battles. Children dreamed of his crimson coat and silver pistols. He had been the last great pirate, not just a raider, but a symbol. He died with dignity. He gave no surrender, no final cry, no plea. One moment he stood, resolute, proud, unbending. And the next, he was gone, as if the age itself had vanished with him. The Golden Age did not end in fire, but in silence. A man falls, a flag is lowered, a sea calms, and in that quiet, history changes. Yet across the centuries, that silence is never complete. It echoes still, in the creak of a ship's timbers, in the flap of canvas sails, in the salt wind that brushes forgotten coves. The stories remain, the names linger, and somewhere, always, there is a boy or girl staring out to sea, wondering what it meant to fly the black flag. Not just for gold, not just for freedom, but for the fierce, impossible dream of living without a master. Long after the last cannon had fallen silent, and the black flags were pulled down for good, something strange happened. The pirates, those ragged outlaws of the sea, did not fade into oblivion. Their ships rotted, their bodies were buried or lost to the deep, but their names remained, etched not into stone, but into memory, into imagination. In taverns and ports, on the edges of empire and far from polite society, sailors still whispered stories of Blackbeard's final stand, of N'Bani's defiance, of treasure maps and secret islands. No matter how loudly the empires tried to rewrite history, a different story lived on below the surface. A myth had taken shape. By the 19th century, long after the last pirate had been hanged or pardoned, the world had changed again. Industrial engines roared where oars once pulled. Steamships replaced sloops and schooners. The oceans, once wild and unknown, were charted, tamed. But as modernity marched forward, nostalgia followed quietly behind. Writers and painters, poets and playwrights, turned their gaze backwards, not to kings and admirals, but to the rebels of the sea. And in doing so, they resurrected the pirate in a new form. No longer the violent criminal, but the romantic rogue, daring, free-spirited, dangerous only to the rich and cruel. The transformation was subtle, then complete. In 1883, Robert Louis Stevenson published Treasure Island, and the modern pirate legend was born. Captain Flint, Long John Silver, the talking parrot, the buried treasure marked with an X. None of it existed in the Golden Age. And yet, these images stuck like barnacles to the collective mind. The real pirates had no eye patches or hooks. They did not sing sea shanties as they loaded cannons. Their lives were brutal, short, and soaked in hardship. And still, beneath that harshness, there was something powerful, a yearning to be free. That yearning is what people remembered. Not the blood, but the rebellion. Not the cruelty, but the courage. In the 20th century, film and television continued the myth. Swashbuckling heroes with fluttering coats and charming smiles danced across screens. Pirate flags became toys, Halloween costumes, amusement park rides. Even as empires crumbled and new wars rose, the pirate endured, in stories, in songs, in dreams. Strangely, even historians began to reconsider them. Yes, many were violent and opportunistic, but they were also, in some sense, early voices of resistance, rejecting kings and classes, building ships where men voted their captains, wrote their own codes, and shared their plunder. And then there were the women. Forgotten for generations, names like N'Bani and Mary Red began to reemerge, no longer as curiosities, but as fierce, fully formed figures. Not sidekicks or exceptions, but equal to their male counterparts, brave enough to defy a world that told them to stay silent. The legends deepened. In Caribbean villages, old folks still tell tales of lost gold hidden in the mangroves. In West Africa, songs recall the ships that came not to trade, but to burn. On the coastlines of New England, locals point to rocky coves and say, "That's where the pirate ship disappeared." Each place remembers differently. Each people holds a piece of the myth. And sometimes, the sea remembers too. In 1984, divers off North Carolina found the wreck of a ship believed to be Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's flagship. There, beneath centuries of silt and coral, lay cannonballs, medical tools, and pieces of gold. Not just relics, but echoes. More than artifacts, these fragments whisper something deeper, that history is never truly buried, that legends, like tides, return. Today, pirates are everywhere, on flags flown in defiance, in stories passed from child to child, in the daring hearts of those who seek freedom on their own terms. They've become more than men and women. They've become metaphors. Not for theft, but for daring. Not for violence, but for vision. For the belief that the world, with all its walls and crowns and coins, could be broken open, that something freer might sail out. And so, the Golden Age of Pirates never really ended. It slipped beneath the surface like a ship hiding in the fog, waiting, dreaming. Because somewhere, always, a child watches the sea, a page turns, a wind rises. And in that moment, the sails lift again, the black flag flies, the drums of freedom beat, and the pirates return, this time not with blades, but with stories. Stories that, like the sea, will never truly sleep. Have you ever stood by the sea just before dusk, when the horizon dissolves into mist and the salt in the air feels older than time itself? There, in that quiet hour when gulls drift like memories and the tide hushes its breath, you might sense it, the ghost of a sail beyond the fog, the echo of a voice that once defied kings. For all their contradictions, pirates were never just villains or heroes. They were a mirror, reflecting the broken world they sailed through, its cruelty, its greed, but also its longing for something freer. They were men and women cast out or broken loose. Former slaves who turned the whip into a flag, sailors who chose mutiny over misery, lovers who dared to wear trousers and carry pistols, poets who hid in stolen ships. Not saints, not monsters, just human beings chasing the same wild wind we still feel today. Empires tried to erase them. They hanged them in ports and rewrote the ledgers. But stories are slipperier than chains. They slip into lullabies, ballads, secret hand signs passed between children. They float ashore in fragments of song. They survive, not because they were perfect, but because they were bold. And boldness, like the sea, never dies. Today, the world no longer belongs to wooden ships or wind charts. But the pirate lives on, not in looted gold, but in every soul who questions the rules, who sails against the current, who believes freedom is still worth chasing. You see it in unexpected places, in art that refuses to flatter power, in movements that gather in hidden corners, in voices that say, there is another way. Because maybe piracy was never really about the ocean. Maybe it was always about imagination, about the space between the known and the possible. A plank, a mast, a torn sail, a promise that somewhere beyond the edge of the map, there is still a place where no flag flies, except the one you choose. And so, if you ever find yourself staring out to sea and the wind brushes your cheek like a whisper, lean in. Listen closely. You just might hear them, those old voices carried on the tide, laughing, shouting, dreaming, not dead, just drifting, waiting for the next soul brave enough to hoist a sail and vanish into legend.